Chapter 2. Alveric comes in sight of the Elfin Mountains. To the long chamber, sparsely furnished, high in a tower, in which Alveric slept, there came a ray direct from the rising sun. He awoke and remembered at once the magical sword, which made all his awaking joyous. It is natural to feel glad at the thought of a recent gift, but there was also a certain joy in the sword itself, which perhaps could communicate with Alveric's thoughts, all the more easily just as they came from Dreamland, which was preeminently the sword's own country. But, however it be, all those that have come by a magical sword have always felt that joy while it still was new, clearly and unmistakably. He had no farewells to make, but thought it better instantly to obey his father's command than to stay to explain why he took upon his adventure a sword that he deemed to be better than the one his father loved. So he stayed not even to eat, but put food in a wallet and slung over him by a strap a bottle of good new leather, not waiting to fill it, for he knew he should meet with streams, and wearing his father's sword, as swords are commonly worn, he slung the other over his back with its rough hilt tied near his shoulder, and strode away from the castle and Vale of Earl. Of money he took but little, half a handful of copper only, for use in the fields we know, for he knew not what coin or what means of exchange were used on the other side of the frontier of Twilight. Now the Vale of Earl is very near to the border, beyond which there is none of the fields we know. He climbed the hill and strode over the fields and passed through woods of hazel, and the blue sky shone on him merrily as he went by the way of the fields, and the blue was as bright by his feet when he came to the woods, for it was the time of the bluebells. He ate and filled his water bottle and traveled all day eastwards, and at evening the mountains of Fairy came floating into view, the color of pale forget-me-nots. As the sun set behind Alveric, he looked at those pale blue mountains to see what color their peaks would astonish that evening. But never a tint they took from the setting sun, whose splendor was gilding all the fields we know. Never a wrinkle faded upon their precipices, never a shadow deepened, and Alveric learned that for nothing that happens here is any change in the enchanted lands. He turned his eyes from their serene pale beauty back to the fields we know, and there, with their gables lifting into the sunlight above deep hedgerows beautiful with spring, he saw the cottages of earthly men. Past them he walked while the beauty of evening grew, with songs of birds, and scents wandering from flowers, and odors that deepened and deepened, and evening decked herself to receive the evening star. But before that star appeared, the young adventurer found the cottage he sought, for, flapping above its doorway, he saw the sign of a huge, brown hide with outlandish letters in gilt, which proclaimed the dweller below to be a worker in leather. An old man came to the door when Alveric knocked, little, and bent with age. He bent more when Alveric named himself, and the young man asked for a scabbard for his sword, yet said not what sword it was. And they both went to the cottage where the old wife was, by her big fire, and the couple did honor to Alveric. The old man then sat down near his thick table, whose surface shone with smoothness wherever it was not pitted by little tools that had drilled through pieces of leather all that man's lifetime and in the times of his fathers. And then he laid the sword upon his knees and wondered at the roughness of hilt and guard, for they were raw, unworked metal, and at the huge width of the sword. And then he screwed up his eyes and began to think of his trade. And in a while he thought out what must be done. And his wife brought him a fine hide, and he marked out on 2 pieces as wide as the sword, and a bit wider than that. And any questions he asked concerning that wide, bright sword, Alvaric somewhat parried, for he wished not to perplex his mind by telling him all that it was. He perplexed that old couple enough a little later when he asked them for lodging that night. And this they gave him with as many apologies as if it were that they had asked a favor, and gave him a great supper out of their cauldron, in which boiled everything that the old man snared, but nothing that Alvaric was able to say prevented them giving up their bed to him and preparing a heap of skins for their own night's rest by the fire. And after their supper, the old man cut the 2 wide pieces of leather with a point at each end and began to stitch them together on each side. And then Alvaric began to ask him of the way, and the old leather worker spoke of north and south and west, and even of northeast. But of east or southeast he spoke never a word. He dwelt near the very edge of the fields, we know, yet of any hint of anything lying beyond them, he or his wife said nothing. Where Alvaric's journey lay upon the morrow, they seemed to think the world ended. And pondering afterwards, in the bed they gave him, all that the old man had said, Alvaric sometimes marveled at his ignorance, and yet sometimes wondered if it might have been skill by which those 2 had avoided all the evening any word of anything lying to the east or southeast of their home. He wondered if in his early days the old man might have gone there, but he was unable to even to wonder what he found there if he had gone. Then Alvaric fell asleep, and dreams gave him hints and guesses of the old man's wanderings in fairyland, but gave him no better guides than he had already. And these were the pale blue peaks of the Elfin Mountains. The old man woke him after he had slept long. When he came to the day room, a bright fire was burning there. His breakfast was ready for him, and the scabbard made, which fitted the sword exactly. The old people waited on him silently, and took payment for the scabbard, but would not take aught for their hospitality. Silently, they watched him rise to go, and followed him without a word to the door, and outside it watched him still, clearly hoping that he would turn to the north or west. But when he turned and strode for the Elfin Mountains, they watched him no more, for their faces never were turned that way. And though they watched him no longer, yet he waved his hand in farewell, for he had a feeling for the cottages and fields of these simple folk, such as they had not for the enchanted lands. He walked in the sparkling morning through scenes familiar with infancy. He saw the ruddy orchies flowering early, reminding the bluebells they were just past their prime. The small young leaves of the oak were yet a brownish yellow. The new beech leaves shone like brass, where the cuckoo was calling clearly, and a birch tree looked like a wild woodland creature that had draped herself in green gauze. On favored bushes there were buds of May. Alvaric said over and over to himself, farewell to all these things. The cuckoo went on calling, and not for him. And then, as he pushed through a hedge into a field untended, there suddenly closed before him, and the field was, as his father had told, the frontier of twilight. It stretched across the fields in front of him, blue and dense like water, and things seen through it, seemed misshapen and shining. He looked back once over the fields we know. The cuckoo went on calling unconcernedly. A small bird sang about its own affairs, and nothing seeming to answer or heed his farewells. Alveric strode on boldly into those long masses of twilight. A man in a field not far was calling to horses. There were folk talking in a neighboring lane as Alveric stepped into the rampart of twilight. At once, all these sounds grew dim, humming faintly, as far great distances. In a few strides he was through. Not a murmur at all came then from the fields we know. The fields through which he had come had suddenly ended. There was no trace of its hedges, bright with new green. He looked back, and the frontier seemed lowering, cloudy and smoky. He looked all around and saw no familiar thing. In the place of the beauty of May were the wonders and splendors of Elfland. The pale blue mountains stood august in their glory, shimmering and rippling in a golden light that seemed as though it rhythmically poured from the peaks and flooded all those slopes with breezes of gold. And below them, far off as yet, he saw going up all silver into the air the spires of the palace only told of in song. He was on a plain on which the flowers were queer and the shape of the trees monstrous. He started at once toward the silver spires. To those who may have wisely kept their fancies within the boundary of the fields we know, it is difficult for me to tell of the land to which Alveric had come, so that in their minds they can see that plain with its scattered trees, and far off the dark wood out of which the palace of Elfland lifted those glittering spires, and above them and beyond them that serene range of mountains whose pinnacles took no color from any light we see. Yet it is for this very purpose that our fancies travel far, and if my reader, through fault of mine, failed to picture the peaks of Elfland, my fancy had better have stayed in the fields we know. Know then that in Elfland are colors more deep than are in our fields, and the very air there glows with so deep a lucency that all things seen there have something of the look of our trees and flowers in June reflected in water. And the color of Elfland, of which I despaired to tell, may yet be told, for we have hints of it here. The deep blue of the night in summer, just as the gloaming has gone. The pale blue of Venus, flooding the evening with light. The deeps of lakes in the twilight. All these are hints of that color. And while our sunflowers carefully turned to the sun, some forefather of the rhododendrons must have turned a little towards Elfland, so that some of that glory dwells with them to this day. And above all, our painters have had many a glimpse of that country, so that sometimes in pictures we see a glamour too wonderful for our fields. It is a memory of theirs that intruded from some old glimpse of the pale blue mountains while they sat at easels painting the fields we know. So Alveric strode on through the luminous air of that land, whose glimpses, dimly remembered, are inspirations here, and at once he felt less lonely. For there is a barrier in the fields we know, drawn sharply between men and all other life, so that if we be but a day away from our kind, we are lonely. But once across the boundary of twilight, and Alveric saw this barrier was down, crows walking on the moor looked whimsically at him. All manner of little creatures peered curiously to see who was come from a quarter whence so few ever came, to see who went on a journey whence so few ever returned. For the king of Elfland guarded his daughter well, as Alveric knew, although he knew not how. There was a merry sparkle of interest in all those little eyes, and a look that might mean warning. There's perhaps less mystery here than on our side of the boundary of twilight, for nothing lurked or seemed to lurk behind great boles of oak, as in certain lights and seasons things may lurk in the fields we know. No strangeness hid on the far side of ridges, nothing haunted deep woods. Whatever might possibly lurk was clearly there to be seen. Whatever strangeness might be was spread in full sight of the traveler. Whatever might haunt deep woods lived there in the open day. And so strong lay the enchantment deep over all the land, that not only did beasts and men guess each other's meanings well, but there seemed to be an understanding even, that reached from men to trees, and from trees to men. Lonely pine trees that Alveric passed now and then on the moor, their trunks glowing always with the ruddy light that they had got by magic from some old sunset, seemed to stand with their branches akimbo and lean over a little to look at him. It seemed almost as though they had not always been trees, before enchantment had overtaken them there. It seemed they would tell him something. But Alveric heeded no warnings, either from beasts or trees, and strode away toward the enchanted wood.